Hi friends! Welcome to Organic True Crime with Sydney Hopes, where I talk about true crime stories and spooky stories, but this month I'm focusing on female killers. This is actually the last video of the Female Killers Month. Today we are going to be talking about Velma Barfield. And I actually chose this one because it's kind of local to me. She was born in South Carolina, which is where I'm from and live, but it mostly takes place in North Carolina, but still, thought that was interesting. In October of 1932, Margie Velma Bullard was born to Murphy and Lillian Bullard. She was the second of eventually 9 children. The Bullards were a farming family. They owned a tobacco/cotton farm. And so all of their 9 children were expected to help out at the farm, which I'm pretty sure is pretty normal for farming families, right? And part of the reason they have so many kids? I don't know. I always assumed that. I don't actually know. I think anyway, so all of the children were expected to help out, and Margie, who started going by her middle name Velma, and I'm going to call her Velma for the rest of the story, Velma hated it. She didn't like being a farmer. She didn't like having to work all the time. She also had a very, very strict and abusive drunk for a father. Murphy Bullard was a very abusive father, and her mother would just sit back and watch and let it happen, and she never stepped up. And Velma always resented her for this. She eventually said that she hated her mother for never standing up for herself or for her children. So, needless to say, Velma did not grow up in a great home, unfortunately. Their farm did not do very well, at least not well enough to support the entire family. So Velma's father, Murphy, did also have to work jobs in town. At a logging mill is mostly where he would go, but I think he just worked jobs around. And so the family did end up moving, and they ended up having to move several times because of her father's different jobs. As Velma grew older, when she was a teenager, she got really into playing basketball. She was really good at it apparently, and really enjoyed playing women's basketball, which I didn't know was really a thing back then, but I guess so. Anyway, and in 1947, Velma met a man named Thomas Burke, but she was only 15 years old at the time, and she was not allowed to date until she was 16. And also, in this year, her mother gave birth to twins and needed more help at home, so Velma ended up having to quit basketball so that she could be home more to help her mom with the twins and with the house. I do want to note that Velma seems like she was a very resentful person, because these are the things that she held on to in life, these parts of her life. And so instead of her parents struggling and needing help, it was, my parents made me quit everything I wanted, which is an understandable thing for a person at that age to be upset about. But I just think it's interesting to see that she held on to these kinds of things. She stayed angry, which some people do, and again, it's understandable. I mean, she was 15 and having to care for children that weren't hers because her parents had more children, which wasn't her fault. But wanted to note that she holds on to things. 2 years later, in 1949, Thomas Burke and Velma got married, and they both quit school, which caused a huge fight between her and her parents. And this was really hard on her, because she did say that despite everything that happened in their household, she was still pretty close with her family. So it was really difficult for her being young and just married, and her parents are upset with her. And then in 1951, Velma gave birth to she and Thomas's first child, Ronald Thomas Burke. And 2 years later, Velma gave birth to their second child, Kim Burke. And Velma loved being a mother. She realized that it was what she was meant to do. She absolutely loved her children. She was very, very involved in their lives. She was very involved in their school once they started going to school. She just really loved being a mom and being a part of everything, and people noticed it. And eventually, around this time, she ended up having to get a job. She worked the night shift at a textile mill, so she worked from midnight to 8 a.m. And then her husband during the day was a Pepsi delivery driver, so he drove the trucks that deliver Pepsis. In 1963, Velma had to have a hysterectomy due to some medical problems that she was having. And it was said that she completely changed after this procedure. She started being really snappy and was depressed a lot and was constantly complaining of back pain. And because of the procedure and then because of the back pain following, she was prescribed medications for these. And even after the procedure, because of her constant back pain, she was continuously prescribed these medications. Just something to note and to hold on to. And around this time, apparently because of her personality change, Velma and Thomas were having a really difficult time in their marriage, and Thomas started drinking. And because of Velma's father and her past, she had an absolute zero tolerance on drinking, and this was a huge problem in their marriage. In 1967, Thomas Burke was arrested for drinking and driving, and he lost his license, which also caused him to lose his job because he was a truck driver. And because of losing his license and his job, Thomas became very depressed, which caused him to drink even more, which caused the fights with his wife to happen even more. She was apparently very religious and again had a zero tolerance on alcohol and was not happy with the way her husband was behaving. But eventually he was able to find a job at a mill in town that he could get a ride to work to. But at this time, Velma starts having really bad anxiety, and her anxiety just gets worse and worse until her son Ronnie comes home from school one day and finds her unconscious in the kitchen. And he runs to her and she comes to, and they go to the hospital. And at the hospital, she is prescribed a mild tranquilizer. It's called Librium. And this was for her anxiety. So she started taking Librium. And this is when Velma's addiction truly started. She started taking more Librium than she was prescribed. And then she went to a different doctor where she got a prescription for Valium. And that became her pattern. She started going to different doctors and not telling each one about the other and getting different prescriptions from each one so that she could have a lot. And then one day in 1969, while the children were at school, Velma went to the laundromat. And she came home, and her house was in flames. And her husband, Thomas, who was the only one home, unfortunately died of smoke inhalation. And she just came home to find this. How terrible. Apparently when this happened, I believe Thomas was in their bedroom, but only the room that he was in really burned. It didn't really do that much damage to the house, so they kept living in it. But very shortly after, the house caught fire again. Crazy. And it burned down. So Velma and her children ended up moving back in with her parents, Murphy and Lillian. The next year, in 1970, Velma met a widower named Jennings Barfield, and they started dating and then eventually got married. And Velma and her two children moved in with Jennings and his teenage daughter, Nancy. Now, Jennings had lots of health issues, which led Velma to have to care for him a lot, and she didn't really like that. And Jennings didn't really like that his wife had a drug abuse problem. And he apparently came home one day and found her semi-conscious on the couch and ended up having to take her to the hospital, where he was told that it happened because of a drug overdose. And because of this, he said he was done. He didn't want to have anything to do with that, so the couple separated. But Velma came to him and said that she promised she would quit and they could work things out, so they got back together. Unfortunately, that did not last very long, because shortly after, he came home again to find Velma unconscious and took her to the hospital and found out it was because of a drug overdose again. So at this point, the couple started discussing divorce, and this is all within their first year of marriage. But oddly enough, right after the couple starts discussing divorce in 1971, Jennings Barfield passed away due to his many health issues. It was eventually heart failure. And at this point, things just go downhill for Velma. She is very depressed, which leads her to turn more so to drugs than she already was. So her addiction got even worse at this point. During this time, Velma was working at a Belk department store. Is it Belk or Belks? I think it's just Belk. Anyway, she's working at a department store, and she was showing obvious signs of drug abuse at work and apparently had mood swings and was not okay being around customers. But instead of firing her, they just moved her to the stock room so that she was not in front of people. Customers didn't see her, and she just did her job in the back. Which I thought was interesting that they still gave her a chance, because they said that it was obvious that it was drug use that was causing her to be this way. But they still, I mean, she had a family to support, I guess. Now, before Jennings had passed away, Velma's oldest son, or only son, Ronnie, had signed up for the army, and he was unable to get out of it after his stepfather passed away, even though he tried very hard to prove to the army that his mother needed him at home, that she wasn't well, and she needed him. But this was during the Vietnam War, and the army decided they needed him more. So Ronnie does still join the army, and shortly after this, Velma's house burns down again. Can you believe that? The luck that this woman has, or maybe she's just irresponsible with flammable things. I don't know. Anyway, their house burns down again, and Velma and her daughter Kim move back in with her parents, Murphy and Lillian. Things continue to just go downhill for Velma. She loses her job at the Belk department store. I guess they eventually just couldn't continue to support her. And also, shortly after she and her daughter moved in to the home, Velma's father, Murphy, died of lung cancer. And then Velma's son, Ronnie, came to her and told her that he had intentions to get married. And she was extremely jealous. She was not okay with this. She did not want her baby boy getting married and leaving her. So Velma did not offer her blessing for the marriage, and because of that, their relationship really strained. Despite having been so close before, she was very, very against his marriage, and he was very, very for it. And it didn't work out very well for the two of them. In 1972, Velma was arrested for forging a prescription. She pled guilty and ended up just having to pay a fine, and then she went back home where she was still living with her mother, Lily. And things were not going well at home with her mother. Velma and Lily did not get along well. Since our daughter was living back in the house with her, Lily was telling her what to do a lot and giving her chores to do, and Velma didn't appreciate that. She said she was a 40-year-old woman and she didn't like being bossed around. And Lily didn't appreciate that her daughter was on drugs all the time and was constantly passing out in their house. So things were very tense at home. And then in 1974, Lily was hospitalized for a sudden and unexplainable illness, which she did recover from after a few days, and she was sent back home. Also at this time, Velma had been dating a man. I couldn't find his name, but her boyfriend at the time died in a car crash, and for some reason, she had already had life insurance, but was the beneficiary of his life insurance policy. So Velma received a life insurance payout after her boyfriend died in a car crash. And then later that year, right after Christmas, her mother Lily was hospitalized again for a sudden and unexplainable illness. And unfortunately, this time she did pass away in the hospital. The next year, in 1975, Velma was arrested for 7 accounts of forgery of cashing fake checks, and she was sentenced to 6 months in jail. But apparently, Velma was a model prisoner. She was just really great in jail. I guess, are you not a prisoner if you're not in prison? Anyway, she was released after only 3 months. After this, Velma becomes a live-in caregiver, and in 1976, she moves in with with a couple named Montgomery and Dolly Edwards. Montgomery, or Monty, was 94 years old at the time, and he had lost both of his legs and also his vision from diabetes. And his wife, Dolly, who was 84. Oh, I didn't notice that they were 10 years apart. Anyway, she was a cancer survivor, and she and Velma did not get along. Dolly thought that Velma didn't do enough. She thought she wasn't an attentive enough caregiver, and Velma thought that Dolly asked way too much of her, and she didn't want to do as much as she even did. And this caused Velma and Dolly to bicker a lot. After about a year of her working of Velma working with the Edwards couple. Montgomery Edwards died, and I'm not sure of what. I assume it was complications from his many health issues he already had, but I'm not actually sure of that. I just know that he passed away. And very shortly after, his wife Dolly suddenly got very ill. She had survived cancer. She was not very sickly. She was not really who Velma was there to care for, but all of a sudden, she was very sick. Because of Dolly's sudden illness, she was taken to the hospital, but she was sent home that same day. And once she got home, her condition just worsened, so she went back to the hospital, and unfortunately, she died a few hours after arriving at the hospital this time. And they couldn't explain exactly what it was. It was just a sudden illness that she died from within a day. Seems sketchy to me. After this, Velma moves on to be a live-in caregiver for another couple. Their names were John Henry, who was 80, and Record Lee, who was 76. Apparently, John Henry and his wife Record argued a lot, and it made Velma very uncomfortable. And she also thought that Record was very talkative, and she found it very annoying. So she didn't really like this couple very much. One day, Record Lee was balancing her checkbook, and she realized that a check had been forged in her name. So she went to the police, but they couldn't really do anything about it. They didn't have any leads or any idea who it was. So nothing really came of that. But shortly after Record's suspicion, her husband John Henry became very ill of a sudden and unexplainable illness. So he was taken to the hospital, and where he stayed for 4 days, and then eventually he was released. The doctor said that it was probably just a virus and he was fine, so they sent him home. After this, John Henry for the next month was just on and off sick. He ended up losing a lot of weight. He became very ill because he would just be really sick suddenly, and then he'd be okay, and then he would get really sick suddenly again. And eventually eventually they did have to send John Henry back to the hospital, where he did die about a month after his original virus. So after this, Velma stops being a living caregiver, and in 1978, she moves in with a man that she was dating. His name was Stuart Taylor. He was a 56-year-old farmer, and he had 2 children of his own from a previous marriage. And one day, the couple were going to a revival meeting of a famous priest that was in town. I'm not sure who it was, but he was traveling, coming through town, and they decided to go one night. But on their way, or right when they got there, it was on their way, Stuart starts feeling really, really sick, so it was not on their way. Once they got there, during the meeting, Stuart starts feeling really, really sick. So he goes to his truck. He's like, you stay and watch the meeting. I'm just going to go have some time outside. And he goes and has to lay down in his truck. And Velma stays for the whole meeting, which I thought was kind of interesting. I don't know. I guess she was very religious, and she was probably very interested and excited to see this traveling famous priest. But it seems kind of mean to leave your significant other just really sick, laying in the truck waiting for you for the whole meeting. But she did stay, and she came back and found him laying in the truck, and he said he couldn't drive them home, so she drove the truck home. But at home, Stuart's condition worsens. He just gets more and more sick, and Velma at this time calls one of his children, her name was Alice, and lets her know that her father is very ill and that they're gonna go to the hospital, and just keep an ear out, just so you know, letting her know that her father's going to the hospital. So they go, and a doctor says that Stuart just has extreme gastritis, so he prescribes him with some medicine and he sends him home. But when they get home, he just keeps being sick, and it gets worse and worse even after the medicine. His condition worsens. So Velma, I thought this was kind of odd. She called the neighbor, and the neighbor called an ambulance for him. I'm not really sure why she didn't call an ambulance, but anyway, she called the neighbor, and the neighbor called an ambulance, and the ambulance came and got him and took Stuart Taylor to the hospital, where he unfortunately passed away very shortly after arriving. And this was really strange. He was a 56-year-old man. He was pretty healthy. He didn't have any past of health issues. So the Dr. Andrews, suggested an autopsy, and Velma agreed. And so Stuart's children, who came to town after their father's death went along with it, and they agreed as well. They originally wouldn't have had one, but they said that since Velma wanted one, why not? The doctor and Velma suggested it. So, Dr. Andrews performs an autopsy on Stuart Taylor, and he does see that he died from gastroenteritis. I think I actually said that right. Don't tell me if I didn't. Anyway, he died from gastroenteritis, but the doctor found that really strange because, again, he was not that old and didn't have any history of health issues. And he also noticed a slight abnormality in his liver. So he decided to take a sample and send it off to North Carolina's chief medical examiner. Got it. Anyway. And when the chief medical examiner received the sample and examined it, I could have used a different word, but I didn't. He found that the abnormality came from arsenic poisoning. So at this point, police start looking into the situation. And you do usually start by looking at the spouse or the significant other who lives with him, who is the only new thing in his life. And when they did that, they realized that a lot of people in Velma's life have died very suddenly of unexplainable illnesses. They also noticed that a lot of these people had autopsies done after their death at Velma's request some of the time. And it was found that a lot of them died from gastroenteritis. Interesting. And none of them really looked further than that because they didn't have a reason to. They didn't think they needed to be looking for poison. It was mostly elderly people, and gastroenteritis does happen. It's a natural thing, so nobody looked further until Dr. Andrews with Stuart Taylor. So after finding all this out, police bring Velma in for questioning, and they tell her that Stuart Taylor died of arsenic poisoning. And she says, that's weird, I don't know how that happened, and denies everything, and they don't actually have any evidence against her, so they can't really do anything or hold on to her, so they send her home, and that's it at that point. At this time, Velma was living with a woman named Mammy Warwick. I think I said that right. She lived there for free as long as she helped out around the house. Mammy let her live there for free. And she wanted to stay there because it was close to where her son was living. And she and her son Ronnie were still pretty close. And Ronnie was made aware of the situation and of her past. He was also aware of her past and of the pattern. And he came to her and he confronted her about it, and he told her what he was afraid of, and he was like, I really hope this isn't true, but it kind of seems that way. And at this point, Velma just breaks down and she says, I only meant to make him sick. So after having said that, Ronnie convinces his mother that she has to go to the police and she has to tell the truth. So he drives her to the police station to be questioned, and she does. She not only confesses to Stuart Taylor's death, she also confesses to killing her mother Lily, and two people that she had previously been a caretaker for, which was John Henry Lee and not Montgomery. He did actually just die, but his wife Dolly. Now, Velma was only ever tried for Stuart Taylor's murder because that was the only one that they had any actual evidence for. But what I thought was very interesting, they were allowed to talk about the other murders, even though in the trial, even though she had not been tried for them or actually convicted of committing them. But the judge decided that it would help the prosecution establish intent if the jury knew about her previous murders. Even though she did confess to them, but she hadn't actually been convicted of them. So I just thought that was really strange. I understand, but still interesting. So Velma Barfield went to trial for Stuart Taylor's murder, and her defense was that she only meant to make him sick. She didn't actually mean to kill him. She was put against the prosecutor, John Freeman Britt, who was apparently known as the deadliest prosecutor because he was sorry, my words just went away from me for a second. He was a very strong advocate for the death penalty. So during the trial, they had medical staff that had worked with Stewart come in and take the stand, and they also had several family members come in. And some of the medical staff explained that there is a cure for arsenic poisoning. So if Velma really hadn't wanted Stewart to die, she could have told them what happened and he could have been cured. But she didn't. She chose to keep that information to herself. And eventually he died because of it. And Velma says that this is because she was afraid she would go back to jail. She didn't want to go back to jail. And she didn't mean to make him that sick. Also, which I guess is a valid point, doctors did say that the drugs that Velma was on at the time could have affected her judgment. So maybe made it seem even more scary to go to jail and made it seem like it was better to just not say anything, I guess. And then Velma took the stand, which usually in a case like this, when someone is being accused of murder, they are advised not to do that because it's very easy to incriminate yourself even if you didn't do anything when being put on the stand. But Velma thought she had it handled. She has been doing this a long time. She knows how to manipulate people and she thought she could do it. And she got up there and she told her story and she explained her drug addiction and how she was struggling and how she even admitted to forging checks when she couldn't afford her drugs because she needed them so badly. And she did a good job of making herself seem like the victim in this case. Until the prosecution got to cross-examine her. And at this point, her attitude changed and she did not make herself look good. She became very snippy when she was asked questions. And she also at one point said that all of the autopsies said that these people died of natural causes of gastroenteritis. She just had happened to poison them also. But the autopsies didn't say they died from poison, so she didn't kill them. No, gastroenteritis comes from arsenic poisoning, but that was her defense. That was what she said, is the autopsies said it was natural causes, so I just happened to also be poisoning them at the same time that they were dying of natural causes. Duh. Unfortunately, that did not work for her. Like I said, that defense did not work out for her, and Velma was eventually convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She was actually the only woman in the state that was on death row at the time, so her jail sentence turned out to be a little interesting, which I'll tell you about in a second. But first, I feel like I need to say, I know that I smile and laugh a lot and am very sarcastic in situations like this. It is not because I am insensitive to the people that it happened to. It's because I just find it so ridiculous that someone can do such a horrible thing and then get on the stand and say, no, I was just poisoning them at the same time that they were dying of something else. I didn't really do this. And just not even, I don't know. It's just so ridiculous to me. I don't know. And that's also just how I deal with things when I'm uncomfortable or upset about something, and I laugh and I smile and I make weird faces. So here we are. Anyway, now let's talk about Velma in jail. At this point in her life, she started going by her first name again, Margie. And remember how before when she was in jail and I said she was a model citizen? This continued in prison, and model prisoner, anyway. She was known as Mama Margie, and she would take girls under her wing in jail. But this was all after going through serious withdrawal when she was first put into jail, and they eventually had to put her on some anti-anxiety medication and then slowly wean her off of it so that she wouldn't be very ill from withdrawal. But she was eventually weaned off of it and became sober in jail. And she had always been very religious, but at this point in her life, she dedicated herself to becoming a real Christian because she admitted and realized that maybe she wasn't being so Christian before when she was murdering people. Anyway, she also wrote an autobiography while she was in jail. It's called Woman on Death Row. I feel like I should read that. I I don't really want to hear what she has to say about herself because I feel like she's going to paint herself as, I don't know, maybe she did take accountability. I don't know. I didn't read it. I don't really want to read something that, I don't know. I would read something written about them, and I read about like their actual past in history, but I don't really want to know from a murderer's point of view why they did what they did and where they are in life, you know? I don't know. Velma was not, I'm still calling her Velma because that's what she was for most of her life. Velma was not on death row for very long, which I thought was interesting because a lot of times you see for like 14 years or something. But I guess she was the only woman on death row, so there wasn't a whole lot in front of her. Anyway, in November of 1984, Margie Velma Barfield was taken to be executed. She was given cheese doodles and a Coke as her requested final meal. I always think that's really interesting. I like to know people's final meals. I don't know why. It's kind of I don't know. Anyway, I like to know it. And now I'm going to read what her last words were, which I noted in another video, but they don't give you a time limit on your final words. I don't know if that's for everybody, though, now that I think about it, but in several cases that I've read, were not given a time limit on their final words. Anyway, I'm going to read what Velma said. I want to say that I am sorry for all the hurt that I have caused. I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I am sorry. And I want to thank everybody who has been supporting me all these 6 years. I want to thank my family for standing with me through all this, and my attorneys and all the support to me, everybody, the people with the prison department. I appreciate everything that they have shown me during these 6 years. I hate reading, but I feel like I have to mention their final words, but I don't like reading out loud, and I'm sorry for the way that it sounds. But I didn't stutter. That is a good thing for me. That is improvement. And that was on my first try too. So, sorry I'm so positive for this. I don't ever really know how I feel about the death penalty. I don't think I ever fully agree with it, but I'm not necessarily extremely against it. There are some cases where I'm not supportive of it, and I wouldn't say I'm supportive of it in any case, but some cases are more so than others, worse than others. I don't know. Anyway, I found the way that they did this one very interesting. She was given the lethal injection, but there were 3 tubes. 2 were connected to her and 1 was not. And there were 3 executioners, and they each injected a lethal injection into a tube, but they didn't know which 2 were connected to her. So they did this so that they wouldn't know who actually killed her. And I thought that was really weird. Just an odd, like, also kind of, you're killing someone, you should own up to that. I mean, even if it is for legal reasons, you still are. That is still what is happening. I don't know. I haven't heard of that before. Maybe they do that in other ones and it just wasn't noted. I don't know. Let me know if you've heard of that before, if you didn't think that that was strange. I don't know. Explain it to me if you can. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me for this one. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. Ones like these really get me because they just get away with it for so long because nobody questions this poor victim. Her husband or significant other got sick. Or in caretakers, she did both. She did different kinds. She was also a caretaker for elderly people, which also gets looked over a lot because they're elderly, they're sickly. Why look into it more, right? Maybe you should. Especially if they were known for not getting along with their caretaker. Or, I don't know, I guess that's not a good enough reason. I don't know what her reason was. She didn't give a reason. She did say she was sorry in her final words, but she was never, like, in jail she did great. She was doing her thing, writing her autobiography. She wasn't, I don't know. I think after you've been caught and you confess to it, maybe you should, I don't know, what can you do? You already killed people, so there's something. Anyway, thank you for joining me on this one. That was the last of this month's female killers. I'll see you for next month. I don't think I'm going to say what the theme is yet. I'll see you then. Why did I do finger guns? Bye.